I'm Katie Snelling, and this is 101 Thoughts. In this episode, we will discuss the legalization of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, or PAS, and how legalization could affect terminally ill and elderly patients. Joining us today to offer more expertise on this subject is Dr. Jerald Bachman, former research professor and University Distinguished Research Scientist at the University of Michigan. Bachman's major research has involved the behaviors of youth in relation to drugs and other influences. From 1994 to 1996, Bachman was involved in a research study and publication that gathered the views of Michigan citizens and physicians on the topic of euthanasia and PAS.
In your article, Attitudes of Michigan Physicians and the Public Towards Legalizing Physician-Assisted Suicide and Voluntary Euthanasia, you conduct a study surveying the general public as well as physicians. Can you tell me more about how this study was conducted?
We took clues from stuff that we've done before, that I've done before, which was to use male questionnaires. They think interviews work better. I'm not sure. In any case, we didn't have the money for that. We had what was considered a large amount of money from the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Foundation, and it was the smallest hunk of money that I've ever worked with.
Wow.
So we managed. But so it meant we had to use male questionnaires. Question about that. We used multiple different questionnaire forms, and I've had experience with that too. But in this case, we wanted to find out whether if the questions were posed in different ways, we got different answers or we got pretty similar answers. And our own preference was to find fairly similar answers. And it turned out that we did. But we tried asking about physician-assisted suicide and death. We used both of those terms in different questionnaire forms. We must have had a dozen different questionnaire forms with various permutations of different ingredients. And one of the ingredients was to distinguish between physician-assisted suicide and physician-assisted death. And it turns out, as one of our correspondents told us when he was reviewing the questionnaires, well, sure, who wouldn't want a physician to assist you during your death? That's that seems obvious. Well, and indeed, once we explained what that involved, and then we used a different questionnaire form to say suicide, we got slightly less support for the suicide version than the physician-assisted death. And I don't quite remember where euthanasia came out of this, but that was a little trickier. In any case, what we did then was write a number of different scenarios that described somebody terminally ill and suffering. And then the question was, all right, should that person be entitled legally to physician-assisted death, suicide, euthanasia, whatever it was? Those questionnaires got a little more support than the ones that said, here's what would be involved. And we thought about whether to just run through what would be involved, and we decided, no, they won't read that. They'll just jump ahead to what's the question.
Right.
We decided that we would solve that problem by turning those things into questions. So we had a number of different questions before they got to the line question, which is, would you support this? Now, in the process of preparing these questionnaires, we ran them by a number of reviewers because we wanted to be sure we got it right. And some of those reviewers were picked from the Michigan Commission, which was in effect some 2.5 decades or so when Jack Kevorkian was in his prime. And so that had people from the whole spectrum, from Michigan Right to Life, and we had a very interesting participant from that group, and he took his task very conscientiously to critique all of our draft questionnaires, and we got some good ideas from them, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which was, let's see, which part would that among other things, it was American Civil Liberties Union and various other liberal ends of the scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so not all of those people. Now, we invited all the people on the Michigan Commission for Death and Dying to offer us suggestions, and not all of them said, yeah, we'll do this, but a number of them did, and we got some very good ideas from them. So we incorporated those and tried to do as well as we could with the questionnaires that we sent out to the general public. And then we sent ones to physicians that looked very much the same. We may have had some slightly different physician-relevant questions, but I don't quite remember that.
Mm-hmm.
It's been more than 2 decades. But in any case, so we sent all those out. We got excellent response rates for a Mayo questionnaire that was challenging. This was not an easy questionnaire.
Mm-hmm.
People were interested in it, and so we got about 70% response from both of them. That was 20 more years ago. Responses for such surveys have gotten much less good over those 2 decades. And partly because everybody's trying to do questionnaires now, and we've got websites set up to do that and all of that. And it interferes, muddies the waters for serious scientific survey research. The American Association for Public Opinion Research, APOR, described those things as sugging and frugging. Sugging was selling under the guise of survey research, and frugging was fundraising under the guise of survey research. And a couple of folks said, well, now, where do we send the money? we had to tell them, no, we don't want any money. We just want your answers. And that was 20 years ago. A lot more probably would say that.
Right.
In any case, we sent them back, and then we'd send a few reminders if we needed to, and so forth. We changed for that kind of survey. And what we had been doing with our bigger study of drug use among youth and young adults. It was an entirely different study, but it taught us a bunch of things to use in this one.
Mm-hmm.
So we got the results back, and substantial majorities favored physician-assisted suicide or more likely death, or I think, as I recall, probably euthanasia as well. And they liked it whether we asked them a bunch of questions about what's involved, or we gave them scenarios. In either way, we got pretty good support.
Interesting.
Then what happened was the Catholic Church launched a major campaign in Michigan to defeat a ballot initiative, and they succeeded. So it didn't happen. But we sent our report, or we sent copies of our report to the Michigan Commission at the time, and we also sent it into the New England Journal of Medicine, which I think prompted the article that you read.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably my best published publication because lots of folks read that, and it was interesting. It was probably the most fun research that I ever did because it was a challenging topic and it was tricky to try to get it spelled out clearly. And so we did a lot of work on these questionnaires. And we also got to attend the meetings of the Michigan Commission on Death and Dying. And they had some very interesting stuff there. So we got to hear. We also got to be blockaded from leaving the room by the Not Dead Yet group that pulled up on their wheelchairs and blocked all the exits.
Oh, wow.
In any case, that was an interesting part of the whole research project.
Right. Yeah, so going into my own personal research on this, I was going in with the idea that this was a completely divided issue that kind of has two kind of concrete sides. But a lot of the research that I ended up doing kind of showed me that in most of the studies that I saw, the general public was usually in favor of physician-assisted suicide and or physician-assisted death, which I found really interesting because I had always thought that it was kind of a 50-50 issue. But yeah, a lot of the research that I did showed that physicians and the general public tend to be in favor of this. Yeah.
Yeah, they want people to have the option. And, there was a lot of worry back a couple decades ago about what would happen when Oregon legalized that. There'd be thousands of people would be coming in there and so forth and so forth. It didn't happen.
Right.
It was more like hundreds. And half of the hundreds, as you may have discovered, didn't use it. But they were very relieved to know that it was available to them if, in the end, they felt the need.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that I find attractive about it, that it gives people choices, and they often don't feel that they need them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of the articles that I was looking into mentioned the intensity of suffering being a large factor in physicians approving these end-of-life options for specific patients. How much of a role do you think this intense suffering... Yeah, I'm kind of just trying to figure out how this intense suffering is kind of measured in a way by physicians, or how much that has a role in determining which patients are eligible for these options.
Well, we described some levels of suffering. I don't remember those descriptions in great detail right now. But one of the issues, I think, how severe does it have to be?
Right.
Now, my wife, who died just under 2 years ago, had suffered's a strong word. She had cancer for about 2 decades. By the time it finally claimed her life. But she had very good care, and so she managed to live a whole lot longer than was expected. In the end, after she'd been doing this for close to 2 decades, the last medicine she was using did not continue to work well. And she had been through various kinds of chemotherapy. What she wound up using last was just something she could take in pill form.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't have to go in for weekly infusions and so forth. So in any case, when that last one ceased to work very well, the doctor said, well, what's left is less promising and more severe. And she said, I've been doing this for 20 years and I think I've had enough. So she had qualified for hospice 4 or 5 years earlier, I think, before she got transferred to another doctor who was better able to do more with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so she said, well, I've had a good long run of it. I've seen a bunch of great-grandchildren. And I'm willing now to let it take its course, but I want hospice care, for which she qualified, as I said, 4 or 5 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So she was, of course, admitted to hospice care again. She didn't really call on it until the last several weeks of her life. But they provided morphine, which she could take as she felt needed and so forth. And that pretty much took care of her pain.
Mm-hmm.
Not entirely, but pretty largely. So, was it intense suffering? Well, I don't think so. I certainly hope not. I don't think so. She would occasionally say, I don't feel very good. But it was, she was not moaning or suffering greatly, as near as I could tell. So in the end, she did sort of what my favorite Woody Allen film was. Did I tell you what that was?
No.
He said, I'm not afraid of dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And I told that to a nurse correspondent a couple of weeks ago or something. And I said the first line, and she said, I don't want to be there when it happens. She knew it. So she's about the same age as I, maybe a year old. So she saw the Woody Allen movie.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in any case, to wrap up the story about how my wife died, she was in our bed with me, with our 2 of our 3 kids downstairs. She had been visited by them and by my granddaughter Emily and her young daughter Jane. And I have pictures of Jenny holding Jane at about 10 or 11 o'clock that evening.
Mm-hmm.
And she died before 6 o'clock the next morning. And she had one moment of calling out, which hospice folks said that's not unusual. But they had given us other medication that could be used then, told us to go ahead and use it. And then the hospice nurse showed up, and Jenny was sedated for the rest of it. She wasn't there when it happened.
Mm.
And it was on Thanksgiving, 61 years after our wedding on Thanksgiving. Wasn't the same day of the month exactly, but it was. And so we all went and celebrated, not at our house, which we thought we would be doing, and folks would take turns going upstairs to see her, but rather we would go to my other son's home in South Lyon and have Thanksgiving. And so we did. And we celebrated that she could depart in the way she wanted. So that gave me a sort of an extra feeling now, 20 years later and more, for what I was researching back then in the late 1990s. Her cancer journey started right around 2000. So we were just sort of wondering about it then. Well, now I've had experience. I wish she was still here, apparently. But that said, we had 61 years that were very, very good, with 3 kids, 6 grandkids, 7 great-grands, and wow. I can't complain. Well, all right, so that's how, that's my personal background.
Right. Yeah, just sort of on the same note of the palliative care system. It seems like your wife had a long experience with that system, and just sort of how that system affects people and their choices with the end of their life. Yeah, I guess the sort of the most important question that I have been just approaching is how people choose quality versus quantity of life when it gets to be the point where they have to make that choice, and how sort of these end-of-life options like physician-assisted death or suicide might give people more of a feeling of peace at the end of their life, that they may have that option available to them if it were to become legal in the area that they are in.
One of the people that spoke to the Michigan Commission on Death and Dying was opposed because he felt that palliative care would solve the problem. And he said, it's already good enough now that you don't have to have this alternative of physician-assisted death. You just get palliative care, or you do like Woody Allen said. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And it's clearly doable. You have to have physicians, hospice nurses, whatever, who are willing to provide that. Not all of them are, but most of them are. Mm-hmm. So, that was his argument. Mm-hmm. And he made it rather persuasively. And it was reassuring in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Some of the research that I did as well sort of got the physician perspective on physicians' opinions on performing these end-of-life options, like, personally. And I saw that some people argue that physician participation in physician-assisted death could be considered contrary to the role of what a physician is supposed to be, rather than helping people to be comfortable in their end of life. Some people see these options as kind of the opposite or the antithesis of what a physician is supposed to be, I guess. I think that's one of the major arguments behind why these options are kind of unliked by some people, is that it seems a bit opposite for physicians to participate in assisting death when life is supposed to be preserved by physicians, if that makes any sense.
It's a fine line.
Right.
And it's really, it's sometimes hard to be able to tell which it is.
Mm-hmm.
One of the terms that I learned back then was hastening inevitable death.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of what hospice does can be described that way.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, in my wife's case, if they hadn't given her morphine and whatever that other drug was, she might have lasted a little longer.
Mm-hmm.
She wouldn't have enjoyed it. And neither would we.
Right.
Watching her suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's hard to draw that line. But hastening inevitable death was one of the terms that came up, and it came up either with hospice or with physician-assisted death.
Hmm.
And as I say, they tend to run together at some. Now, some folks, and often for religious reasons, don't feel that they can do anything to shorten their God-given life.
Mm.
And I've got my one son's father-in-law is very seriously ill with COVID. But he has said he wants every measure taken to keep him going.
Wow.
It's not clear what'll be left of him when he does. But that's what he said. I've said something different. I said, I'm not afraid of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the whole idea of the good death and what it's just so personal that's kind of a part of this physician-assisted suicide and death argument, is that the argument of people having autonomy over their own life, and that includes end of life, and just having access to every possible option, because this process is so individualized and so personal for everyone, that maybe having these additional options, even if they're not frequently used, would still be beneficial in giving people, again, more peace of mind at the end of their life, just knowing that these things, this range of options is available to them, and that they're not just confined to one or two specific options at the end of their life.
Well, that certainly figured largely in our research. And some people wrote interesting extra comments. Not content with taking a nearly hour-long questionnaire, they wrote some comments on the questionnaires as well. And they included things like having autonomy.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it.
For listening to today's episode of 101 Thoughts. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Dr. Bachman for providing this valuable information on his study and publication. We hope you'll join us again for the next episode. Thank you.